Retinol has been the superstar ingredient in our skincare for like decades now, right? But I do feel like it's only really with the rise of the interest in skincare since the pandemic that everybody feels it's an essential part of their skincare routine. Dermatologists, other experts are saying retinol is a must-have in your routine. Dog hair? Yes. But its popularity now seems to be growing even more, even as like industries like K-beauty is now picking up on retinol, an industry that used to like really not go for those higher percentage actives or strong actives in general. People are seeing it as an essential all across the world. And while it may be this miracle ingredient for many, retinol actually has a pretty dark and disturbing history that I was only made aware of maybe like 6 months ago. And this is a history that is often ignored by the beauty companies who profit from it, and that is completely unknown to the majority of beauty consumers. Today, I want to discuss the racist history of retinol. I'm going to talk about what is retinol, right? But you can completely skip this bit if you already know, because you're watching a skincare channel. I'm pretty sure you know what retinol is. Just so we're all on the same page, you know? I've got to mention, I'm having a reaction to something around my eyes, so they're going to look like a little bit swollen there right now, but very dry and red, so ignore that. So retinol is a form of vitamin A. It belongs to a group of vitamin derivatives, also known as retinoids. So you may have heard of some of the other retinoids, such as tretinoin, if you suffer from or have suffered from acne in the past, which is a little bit more difficult here to get in the UK, but will often be prescribed to you when you're a teenager. And retinol is one of the milder forms of retinoids, which is why it's so common in our skincare. And it's a popular ingredient because, as I mentioned, it is the gold standard when it comes to better aging, anti-aging, well-aging ingredients, and other than sunscreen, one of the only really scientifically backed ingredients to help with the prevention of early signs of aging, helping with the appearance of fine lines, wrinkles, acne, improving skin texture, hyperpigmentation, and even helping with congested pores. So it's no wonder that so many people swear by it, right? However, despite retinol being mild in comparison to other retinoids, that doesn't mean that using it isn't without its risks, right? As with many other high percentage active or what could be considered harsher active ingredients, it still can be quite harsh for those with sensitive skin. So being aware of how to properly use retinol is really important, and the risks involved. And I think we've all been there. We've all started using a retinol and had that drying, purging, peeling kind of stage. But we're quite lucky now. A lot of them are made in these amazing like oily or moisturizing formulations. There's loads of buffering techniques around encapsulated retinol. So there are a lot of things going on in formulation nowadays that prevent those kind of risks. But it doesn't mean using retinol is without them. But the potential risks of using retinol and higher percentage actives can be even higher for people with brown and black skin. Regardless of skin color, if you use a retinol which is too strong, apply too much of it all at once, or use it too regularly, then you risk causing dryness, peeling, itchiness, inflammation, and general damage to your skin barrier. We've all been there, as I said. Easy mistake to make, beginner's mistake. But the chance of causing damage to your skin with retinol or high percentage actives is higher if you are a person of color or you have black skin. And on top of that, because they tend to be more reactive to any damage or irritation, meaning that any damage caused to the skin has a much higher likelihood of causing post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation in those with darker skin tones rather than lighter. So anyone who isn't white, basically, regardless of how sensitive your skin is or how easily sensitized your skin is. So the higher concentration of melanin in brown and black skin makes it more prone to pigmentation. So when damage is made, the more likely you are to get dark spots and uneven skin tone. Even me, who is a latte brown, like a very milky latte, when I get a spot and it's damaged, or when I get post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation, that pigmentation is there to stay for months and months and months. It's very hard and very stubborn to get rid of. And I'm much lighter on the Fitzpatrick scale. Now, that's not to fearmonger. That's not saying that, you know, people of color or people with black skin shouldn't use retinol or high percentage actives. It just means that, like anyone really, you have to start slow, you have to start low, and you have to be steady. But the damage that can potentially be done is greater for those with brown and black skin. In an article by the Huffington Post, Deborah Kilgore, the global director of skincare knowledge at Paula's Choice, said, if you're new to retinols and are intrigued by high potency or prescription grade options, a session with a dermatologist will be the best place to start. This advice is true for everyone, but it's particularly important for darker skin tones, which can be more susceptible to irritation that can escalate into issues like post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation. And that is good advice. The only trouble is that according to the same article, which I'll link in the description for you to read, only 3% of all dermatologists in the US are black. And the author of the article makes a very good point that this lack of representation in dermatology is the reason why so many skincare issues that affect people of color, black skin, brown skin, affect all these different communities, all these issues that they experience are either misdiagnosed or undertreated. A good example is rosacea. I have rosacea, it looks red on my skin, but when you compare that to rosacea on black skin, it is completely different. Like, I would not look at rosacea on black skin and think, oh, that's rosacea, mainly because I'm not a dermatologist, I wouldn't know. But you can see why, if you're not experienced in that particular subject, or your knowledge only goes so low on the Fitzpatrick scale, you can see why a lot gets misdiagnosed or undertreated, or not treated at all. And theoretically, dermatologists should be trained to understand how to accurately diagnose and treat different skin issues across the board, right? But unfortunately, very few dermatology programs include a specific requirement to gain experience treating patients, again, across the Fitzpatrick scale. And surveys have actually shown that around half of all dermatologists would say that their medical training didn't adequately prepare them to treat patients of color or black skin. And it's this lack of representation and lack of education when it comes to treating all different skin colors. And this is like a deeper lying issue. There's a saying that the beauty industry is inherently racist, with a strong link to how people of color and black people have been treated throughout history by Western society. And the next part of this video is the perfect example of what I mean. Throughout much of the 20th century, US prisoners were often used as test subjects for medical, pharmaceutical, and cosmetic experiments. Prisons were seen as almost like the perfect place to like carry out long-term studies, because they provided like researchers with a controlled environment and a supply of people who had little to no say over their own lives. And as awful as that sounds, it becomes even worse when you consider that racial inequalities in the US meant that black prisoners were most likely to become involved in these often dangerous and hugely unethical experiments. Systemic racism not only led to black people being imprisoned at a vastly higher rate than other races, and quite often innocent black men in particular were being imprisoned, it also left them more vulnerable to exploitation and abuse once they were in the prison system. One of the most infamous examples of these prison experiments is linked to retinol and retinoids in general. Dr. Albert Kligman was a dermatologist who conducted a wide variety of tests on inmates at the Hornblum prison in Philadelphia throughout the 1950s and the 1960s. And one of the studies that he carried out was research into the uses of retinol and other derivatives of vitamin A. His experiments included the application of various retinoids, often in dangerously high doses, to skin of prisoners to test their efficacy and safety. And these prisoners were subjected to repeated applications of these chemicals, many of which caused really painful side effects such as skin irritation, blistering, peeling, open wounds, and even long-term damage. And that was just the retinoid tests. And over the next few decades, Kligman carried out all sorts of experiments at the prison. He started out with studies that focused on dermatological research, like the uses for retinoids and cures for ringworm, but soon he expanded into carrying out research on far more dangerous substances. These included testing dioxin, a poison which was later used in the Vietnam War, and according to the Vietnamese government was responsible for over 400,000 deaths, as well as testing radioactive materials and chemicals which caused nerve and brain damage on the prisoners, their test subjects. He also carried out tests on mind-altering drugs for the US Army. Unsurprisingly, the prisoners used in these experiments said they weren't told what kind of drugs they were going to be given. These experiments produced a range of long-lasting side effects, from hallucinations for days on end to sudden violent behavior and even temporary paralysis. Black prisoners were often specifically targeted by Kligman and his research associates because he and his team found it easier to coerce black inmates into participating due to their lack of resources, educational disparities at the time, and marginalized position in society and in the prisons. The prisoners were paid small amounts, very small amounts to participate, often between $30 to $50, though sometimes they could get anything up to $800. But Kligman and his associates would often withhold details about the experiments, and they would even outright lie to the prisoners about the nature of the experiments, and of course the risks involved, the long-term and short-term side effects. And if they did provide consent forms, they were usually very vague and misleading, but that's if they even bothered with consent forms in the first place. Now, these experiments conducted by Kligman eventually led to the development of tretinoin, a synthetic version of retinol, which is far stronger. Kligman later marketed his new discovery as Retin A, a prescription retinoid cream used to treat acne, promote skin rejuvenation. You know Tret. It became one of the first retinoid-based treatments widely marketed for skincare, and Kligman and his associates made large sums of money off its discovery, like huge. They didn't seem bothered that the subjects used in their experiments often suffered long-term health effects, skin problems, cancers, and a huge wide range of other illnesses. And that was just the aftermath of the tests. Many of the subjects obviously reported being in excruciating pain during those experiments. But despite the clearly unethical nature of Kligman's experiments, he managed to carry on unquestioned for a very, very long time. And it wasn't until the FDA investigated his research program in 1965 that he actually underwent any kind of scrutiny, any real scrutiny, kind of. But it wasn't until July of 1966 that the FDA actually banned Kligman from conducting drug testing at the Holmesburg prison, but not for the atrocities that he was committing, not for the cruelty that he was committing on these prisoners, but simply for discrepancies in his record keeping. That's all they cared about. They didn't care about how unethical and how cruel these tests were. It was because he had bad bookkeeping. And just a month later, they actually ended the ban and he was able to carry on with his experiments. And he got away with this because he blamed prisoners for the bad record keeping. So he essentially wasn't punished in any way whatsoever, despite people knowing exactly how these experiments were carried out. So it wasn't until the early 70s that the media really started to get wind of what was happening at Holmesburg prison, and they, along with the general public, were outraged, rightfully outraged. Countless news stories were run portraying the prison and Kligman in a very negative light, with the media criticizing the experiments as inhumane and even comparing them to the Nazi concentration camp experiments. Now, this exposure of what was happening in Kligman's experiments led to public outcry, but also renewed discussions about the ethics of medical experimentation on prisoners, causing further discussion about how racial inequalities and the prison system were used to exploit vulnerable populations for scientific research. So this public outcry actually led to a congressional hearing on human experimentation in 1973, where they also discussed the Tuskegee, is that how you say it? Tuskegee, Alabama, right? Syphilis case, which I talked about in my history of animal testing video. With rising pressure from Senate hearings, regular negative news stories, and the public who were very verbally outraged, the prison board finally got the hint that this kind of unethical human experimentation wasn't acceptable, and they shut down experimentation at the prison in 1974. It's so bizarre because that seems like so not long, like that's my parents' lifetime. It just felt that like some of these timelines don't make sense. I'm just like baffled, but I shouldn't be surprised. And Kligman rightfully finally came under significant criticism for his actions, his experimentations, although he did continue to defend his work, saying it was advancing dermatology and was consistent with the scientific and ethical norms of the era. However, his critics didn't agree, with many actually pointing out that his experiments contradicted the Nuremberg Code, which were a set of ethical principles created after the Second World War in order to prevent this kind of experimentation, the kind of atrocities, cruelty that the Nazis had committed in those concentration camps. So the US was actually one of the biggest advocates for the Nuremberg Code, but apparently only when it came to other countries, seeing as they were blatantly going against it all the time. The Nuremberg Code states that the person involved should have legal capacity to give consent, should be so situated as to be able to exercise free power of choice without the intervention of any element of force, force, fraud, deceit, duress, overreaching, or other ulterior form of constraint, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding of enlightened decision. And of course, too many, the experiments carried out by Kligman clearly violated this code because the inmates couldn't give informed consent. They were lied to about what was actually being tested on them, the risks that were involved, short-term and long-term, and they only consented due to the monetary reward and coercion by the so-called scientists and prison guards. Kligman's research at Holmesburg Prison has since become seen as a textbook example, of unethical experimentation. Thankfully, some good, you can say, came out of all of this, the Holmesburg Prison experiments and other similar examples of this kind of testing. This led to changes in how medical research on human subjects was conducted, and in the 1970s, regulations were enacted to restrict medical experimentation on prisoners, ensuring stricter ethical standards and emphasizing informed consent. Unfortunately, Kligman faced no legal repercussion whatsoever for what he had done. In fact, he'll go on to be a member of the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania for over 50 years. They were likely happy to keep him on, seeing as he was donating millions of dollars to their dermatology department, using money he had made from his discovery regarding the uses of tretinoin during his experiments. But he didn't completely get off scot-free, as his reputation was severely and rightfully damaged after his experiments at the prison. Despite going on to have a long career in dermatology, Kligman is still most well known for the unethical experiments he carried out whilst at Holmesburg Prison. In 1988, Alan Hornblum even wrote a book which documented the horrific experiments carried out by Kligman and provided details about the inadequate consent procedure they used. The title of this book is Acres of Skin, which comes from a quote Kligman gave in an interview about his reaction when he first entered the prison to discuss carrying out these experiments. He apparently said, "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time." How fucking gross is that? If that doesn't make it clear that Kligman didn't see these people as actual human beings, then I don't know what will, It's gross. But sadly, Kligman wasn't the only person doing these things in the US. Retinol testing on black prisoners is just part of a larger troubling history of unethical medical experiments on marginalized groups in the US, especially during much of the 1900s. And these experiments just highlight how vulnerable these people were and how easy it was to exploit them without their consent or proper ethical guidelines, and the fact that they can just do it because nobody cared. Nobody gave a shit. The unethical experimentation on black prisoners has left a deep legacy of mistrust in the medical system, and this distrust is only made worse by the failure of US courts to make things right. After the truth about what Kligman was doing at the Holmesburg prison came out, there are multiple lawsuits filed against him, filed against the prison, the University of Pennsylvania, and filed against some of the companies who hired Kligman to carry out the research, such as Johnson & Johnson and Dow Chemicals. Now, some of these lawsuits were actually settled out of court, but the biggest one was a lawsuit which was filed by 298 ex-prisoners who had been involved in these experiments failed. They were all former test subjects, obviously, and they had experienced long-lasting repercussions from these experiments and were asking for free medical care, essentially, and financial compensation for what had been done to them, which really is the least they can do, right? However, the federal court eventually ruled that the statute of limitations had passed and dismissed the case altogether. And this lack of accountability for the harm caused during these experiments has really been seen by many as a damning indictment of the US justice system overall, and further evidence that US institutions are unwilling to correct the wrong done to marginalized communities, especially if it means punishing rich white people. Now, of course, the aim of this video isn't to get anyone to stop using retinol, right? The ingredient itself isn't to blame here, and it's still considered a miracle ingredient by many skincare enthusiasts. But considering that it's been a very popular cosmetic ingredient for decades now, and only seems to be growing in popularity in recent years, very few people people are aware of the history of retinol and other retinoid-based products. As I said, I didn't know about this till fairly recently, and I just think it's important to know. Vulnerable populations have often been subjected to dangerous and painful experiments throughout history. As we know, the history of exploitation in medical and cosmetic research in particular, and the human cost behind many scientific advancements is not something that should be forgotten. So I think it's important to acknowledge that whilst retinoids have undoubtedly advanced skincare, the exploitation of black prisoners in these experiments should be remembered. And it should serve as a reminder of the importance of ethical safeguards in research. And the legacy of these experiments really has left lasting scars on marginalized communities, the black community, the field of dermatology. Even today, black people and many people of color actually are more likely to turn to natural remedies rather than trusting cosmetic companies and scientifically tested products. And who can blame them, really? As I mentioned, the beauty industry, cosmetics industry is still inherently racist. There is still a lack of representation for people of color, black people in the beauty world when it comes to research, studies, the subjects in those studies. And that shows itself in many, many ways. From the shortage of black dermatologists and dermatologists of color, the lack of training dermatologists get and other medical professionals receive about treating the other half of the Fitzpatrick scale, to beauty products being bought out in very limited shade ranges and advertising campaigns that don't feature any diversity, which is a problem I thought we had conquered, but it's still so prevalent. And there is still a lot of work to be done to make the world of skincare and beauty in general truly diverse, like naturally feeling very diverse and representative of all skin colors. And remembering stories like this one today, I really feel is an important part of that. Racial inequality has been commonplace in the beauty world for decades, and we need to acknowledge that before we can go on to change things and fix it. This has been an interesting topic because when I talk about a lot of brands, or even some of my favorite brands, there are the odd brand that people bring up and say, I don't use them because of the founder, or I don't use them because the founder did this, or I don't like them because they do this, blah, 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 blah. And I always say, I don't bring these subjects up to put people off using a brand or using a product. It's down to you and what you feel is almost like forgivable, I guess you can say, when it comes to certain topics or certain things that brands have done. There are plenty of brands that I won't use because of who the CEO is or because of things that they have done. Maybe a controversial topic I'd love for us to discuss in the comments is when it comes to these kind of topics, when you support a brand or don't support a brand, even more so, sorry, what is the limits? What is the statute of limitations on when you stop supporting a brand? For example, Revolution Beauty, I won't use them because the original founder liked some racist Instagram comments. I don't like how much they rip off smaller businesses. Their duping culture is too dupey for me. But when it comes to the founder, I believe the founder isn't involved financially in the business anymore. So now do I start using Revolution? I won't. But do you know what I mean? For example, do you not use retinoids now because of what it stands for? For a lot of people, being able to pick and choose what cosmetics you can afford to not use is a privilege, but I always do these videos just so you can make an informed decision, whatever your decision may be. I'm not really sure what I'm asking, but let's discuss in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching today's video. You can watch some more beauty deep dives here and some general lighter entertainment here, and I'll see you next time.